Okay, may I direct your attention now to the video, Spiro?
God is love. Free will is an essential element of love. Jesus, the only begotten Son of God, is love incarnate. Jesus is the Christ. Therefore, Christianity stands in witness to our faith in God, peacefully uplifting Christ against all forms of evil and tyranny. Let freedom ring. Let love reign in the hearts and souls and minds of everyone. Let love transform the world from the inside out. Let love prevail. Amen.
Mosul, Iraq. Until recently, it was home to 2.5 million people of diverse ethnic and religious backgrounds. But in 2014, the Islamic State pushed out the Iraqi army and seized control of this ancient city and its people. Christians, Yazidis, and other non-Muslims immediately became targets of vandalism, assault, rape, murder, property seizure, expulsion, martyrdom, and genocide.
The city of Mosul was a city where the peaceful coexistence of many faiths was a reality for centuries and centuries, and now it had fallen in an instant. Before our very eyes is a modern-day persecution that's unfolding. When our communities saw the atrocities taking place and the forced evictions of the Christians of that area, we said we have to do something.
Inspired to make a difference for their brothers and sisters in Christ, Father Philemon and his community started the Christian Rights and Freedom Institute.
We realized that education must be fundamental to what we do. We need to educate ourselves and others about what's happening so that we can learn. The more people who know, the more people who care, the more likely that the swell of support for intervening will become a reality.
Sadly, Mosul, Iraq does not stand alone as an example of religious persecution. In more than 60 countries around the world, Christians are routinely persecuted for their faith, and in more than 15 of those countries, Christian genocide is unfolding. At the heart of the matter is the rising tide of Islamic extremism that is producing terrorist attacks across the globe and here at home in the United States of America. The September 11th, 2001 attack on the World Trade Center, the Fort Hood shooting, the Boston Marathon bombing, the San Bernardino attack, the Orlando nightclub shooting, the Minneapolis knife slashing. While our nation has been under attack, our citizens have found their freedom to discuss these issues is also under attack.
Our society is being afflicted by an overwhelming trend towards political correctness. People, through fear and intimidation, are feeling that they cannot speak or cannot challenge. Every time we do that, we give away a piece of ourselves, a piece of our identity.
Dr. Harry Demopoulos grew up in Istanbul, Turkey. At age 15, he survived a citywide assault on ethnic Greeks, Armenians, and Jews. It was later documented that this pogrom, perpetrated by a mob of more than 100,000 Turks, was directly orchestrated by the Turkish government as its final solution to rid the city of its non-Muslim population.
We find that we were specifically targeted for ethnic cleansing. We saw churches being burned, cemeteries where our grandparents and so forth used to be buried, now desecrated. It was very clear, the message was very clear, it's time to leave. It's time to depart, make a new life, go somewhere else. And that's when I decided as a young boy to come to America. In my lifetime, I see the changes in our culture, in our attitude towards faith. The things that used to mean a lot when I came here are less and less. We don't realize how fast we can lose our freedoms here in the United States if we don't stand up for the values that we cherish.
We must raise our voices. We must arrest these disturbing trends. And unless we foster dialogue and share our faith and values, remind ourselves of our histories, unless we do all of those things, we are at risk of losing our identities.
You can make a difference in protecting religious freedom, putting an end to Christian genocide, standing up for human rights, raising your voice on current moral and ethical issues by joining the Christian Rights and Freedom Institute. To find out how, visit the Christian Rights and Freedom Institute online at www.christianrightsandfreedom.org.
Thank you very, very much. Ladies and gentlemen, now I would like to introduce to you our presiding priest, Father Philemon Patitsas. A few words about him before I call him to the podium. I see him, or we see him, in his parish as our indefatigable leader, a man of ideas, the inspiration and driving force for all we do, with an incredible level of energy, dynamism, and positive attitude. A man full of love for the people, devoted to the Lord, embracing the poor and the downtrodden, rejecting privileges with unshakable conviction in the righteousness of the lowest. A rare person with a gift to make the world a better place through his unremitting pursuit of faith, freedom, and justice. It is my great pleasure to introduce to you Father Philemon. Thank you.
If you would please rise now for the opening prayer for the invocation. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit, let us pray to the Lord. Lord, have mercy. O heavenly King, Comforter of the Spirit of truth, you are present everywhere and fill all things, treasury of blessings and giver of life. Come and abide in us, cleanse us from all our stains, and save our souls, O gracious one. In the first chapter of Genesis, you revealed, O God, that mankind is unique among all creation. Let us make man in our image according to our likeness. Let them have dominion over the fish of the seas, over the birds of the air, and over the cattle, over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth. So God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them. Genesis 1, 26, 27. In Genesis 32:38, Jacob wrestles with God and is duly renamed Israel, which means he who struggles with God. Afterwards, Israel names the place where this occurred Peniel, meaning the face of God. For I have seen God face to face, and my life is preserved. Genesis 32:30. Elsewhere in the book of Isaiah, you proclaimed, I have inscribed you on the palm of my hands. Isaiah 49:6. What is man that you are mindful of him, and the Son of Man that you visit him? For you have made him a little lower than the angels. You have crowned him with glory and honor. Psalm 8:4 and 5. In testifying about our Lord Jesus Christ, St. Paul proclaimed that he is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn over all creation, Colossians 1:15. And in 2 Corinthians chapter 4, that he is the image of God. You have given us the capacity to love and to create. You have given us the freedom to choose between right and wrong, to conceive ideas and bring them to fruition, to develop powerful medicines for healing, and to explore even the outer reaches of the universe. In the book of Proverbs, you have instructed us that as in water, face reflects face, so a man's heart reveals the man. Proverbs 27:19. How can it be, Lord, after so many revelations and with these existential realities, that so many people still do not understand that we were made to reflect you, that you have made us for a purpose and for greatness according to your will? How is it that we still demean and dehumanize people, enslaving and exalting ourselves over them? How is it that wars and persecutions and genocides still exist? How is it that women are still treated as less than full citizens or treated as property? How is it that the universal human rights promulgated by the United Nations still go unrecognized? Let our hearts reveal your divine presence. Let them reveal that we are people of faith, and hope and love, and that you abide in us as the immaterial God. But we all, with unveiled face, beholding as in a mirror the glory of the Lord, are being transformed into the same image from glory to glory, just as by the Spirit of the Lord, 2 Corinthians 3:18. This is your will and your divine destiny for those that love you, Lord God. Let us witness our faith by peacefully uplifting Christ as we fulfill this destiny for humanity. Amen.
Please continue standing while I'll invite Kristina Vukovic for the national anthem. Face the flag here.
Oh, say, can you see by the dawn's early light what so proudly we hailed at the twilight's last gleaming, whose broad stripes and bright stars through the perilous fight o'er the ramparts we watched were so gallantly streaming, and the rockets' red glare, the bombs bursting in air, gave truth to the night that our flag was still there. Oh, say does that star-spangled banner yet wave o'er the land of the free and the home of the brave?
Thank you very much, Kristina. And now, to recite the Pledge of Allegiance, I call Markela Patitsas.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Now you can all sit. Sorry about that. Okay. Father Philemon, distinguished clergy, Presbytera Maria, Parish Council President and members of the Parish Council, members of the Christian Rights and Freedom Advisory Board, distinguished speakers, archons of the Ecumenical Patriarchate, invited guests, ladies and gentlemen. Good afternoon and welcome to everyone to our third annual National Symposium of the Christian Rights and Freedom Institute. I'm the chairman, Harry Demopoulos. It is an honor for me to welcome you to this event, for the courage and the intellectual curiosity that brings you here this afternoon to participate in a discussion of the struggle to bridge the human rights divide, Judeo-Christian culture, and Islam. Our moderator will be Mimi Gregory, who will introduce our panelists to you in a few minutes. You have a short bio in your chairs that you can acquaint yourselves with. I will go through a few administrative matters. And the first one is, how many of you have cell phones? All right, I want to see those cell phones, and please turn the button off. Put them in airplane mode or any on and off button. Make it silent, please. It is very disturbing for the video and also for the speakers, I presume. So the other thing I must caution you is if you want to walk Please do not walk in front of the cameras. There are 2 cameras back there. And so if you can make sort of, sideways and go around the cameras, otherwise you'll be filmed and it'll be a hit. It will be a Oscar material. Okay, so let me see what else I have to say. The prepared remarks of each speaker will last about an hour, a little over, and then what will happen is there are slides that will be presented. You'll see the screen here. After the formal presentations, and all 4 speakers have given you their perspective, if you will, the screen will lift and the speakers will go behind the screen. There is a table with their own microphone, so they'll sit on that table so that they can take your questions. We allow about an hour of Q&A. So please do not be bashful, and we invite you to ask almost anything you want, except it has to be pertinent to the topic. Okay? So, now you will see 2 microphones on each side. See one over there and one over there. When the Q&A time comes up, please walk and go behind one of the microphones and then form a queue. Don't just be bashful. Form a line if you want to ask questions so we know how many people want to engage the panel. Ask your question. Get close to the microphone like that. Ask your question. State your name also. That helps. And then keep your remarks short so we hear more from the speakers as to their point of view. And now, it is my true pleasure to introduce our moderator, Mimi Gregory. She has been a leader in international affairs for the better part of 35 years. Her affiliation with the World Affairs Councils began in Boston, where she served on the program committee as vice president. And since living in Naples, she has been a member of the Leadership Council of the Naples Council of World Affairs, served as president for 3 years, and remains today vice president of programming, where she took this role in 2013. Mimi was also appointed to the National Board of the World Affairs Councils of America in 2004 and served 2 terms as a board member until 2010. And then there's another gem I didn't know about Mimi, which is her relationship with the French community in the United States, which included leading Alliance Française chapters in Minneapolis, in Boston, and Bonita Springs, where else. As their president, she was past president of the Federation of Alliance Française USA, which comprises 114 chapters throughout the United States, and has been twice decorated by the French government, most recently as Commander of the National Order of Merit in 1912 by none other than a decree of President Nicolas Sarkozy. And so she is, I should say it this way, the Christian Rights and Freedom Institute is very proud to have her serve as in our advisory committee of our institute, together with Father Michael Orsi and Stuart Roth, who are here today, and I thus recognize and thank you very much for that. Ladies and gentlemen, Mimi Gregory. I'm going to move over there.
Oh, sorry for that. Good afternoon. I'd like to welcome all of you to our 3rd annual National Symposium, and I'm really very pleased to have the opportunity to introduce our speakers today, who bring a wide range of experience on Middle Eastern affairs, from historical points to current event conflicts as we face this human rights divide, raising the difference between our 2 cultures, our Judeo-Christian culture and Islam. So where does the U.S. stand today? The Department of Justice reminds us, quote, that one of our nation's fundamental principles is that all people, regardless of where they worship or what they believe, are entitled to equal protection and fair treatment under the law. This long-standing embrace of religious pluralism and respect for diversity has made our country a beacon of hope and a place of refuge for people from all across the globe. From the Exodus led by Moses 1,000 years before Christ came the appearance of empires and leaders like Cyrus the Great, who overthrew Babylon in 539 BC. He further gave the promise not to force any person to change his religious beliefs and guaranteed freedom for all. Cyrus memorably put words into action by freeing the Jews captured by Nebuchadnezzar. One of history's most important agreements came after 300 years of persecution by the Roman Empire, when Emperor Constantine of Rome and Emperor Licinius of the Balkans signed the agreement known as the Edict of Milan in 313 AD, guaranteeing the, quote, toleration of the Christian faith. Hundreds of years later, the Islamic tidal wave began to settle into communities, and a system of governance emerged with the Umayyad Islamic Caliphate, guaranteeing religious freedom in 625 AD. By contrast, today's nascent radical caliphate bears huge culpability for the continuum of religious persecution in the Levant. The Middle East's extended religious struggles have sent 19 million people into refuge. While this migration does not stand alone in history, it recalls the post-World War II resettlement of millions and reminds us that religious life lives on a battleground. It also inspired the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, adopted by the United Nations General Assembly on 10 December 1948 at the Palais de Chaillot in Paris. The declaration arose directly from the experience of the Second World War and represents the first global expression of what many people believe to be the rights by which all human beings, men and women, are equally entitled. And now it's my pleasure to introduce our first speaker, Mr. Stuart Roth, Esquire. Mr. Roth will share his views on the refugee crisis, the United Nations, immigration policy, and how our faith and politics collide on these hot-button issues. Additionally, Stuart will offer a brief overview of the evolution of U.S. Middle East policy, analyze what's likely ahead in the region. He's got a great crystal ball, and address the question of why don't they like us. Please welcome Stuart Roth.
Who said they don't like us? Welcome. The refugee crisis cannot be ignored by the church nor swept under the rug by each of our own particular political persuasions. Believe me, I've tried, and it doesn't work. I'm reminded as we gather here together of the purposes of the Christian Rights and Freedom Institute. We stand and witness to our faith in God, peacefully uplifting Christ against all forms of evil and tyranny, such as genocide, persecution, totalitarianism, fascism, slavery, human trafficking, cruelty, and terrorism. As all of us sadly know, millions of Christians and Muslims in Middle Eastern countries have been forced from their homes as a result of the types of persecutions I just mentioned. The question we must ask today, what should our response be to those in such dire need? As senior counsel with the American Center for Law and Justice, I have practiced law with last year's keynote speaker, Jay Sekulow. I see many familiar faces from last year. We both graduated from law school together 37 years ago. We have recently filed numerous briefs in support of the President's recent executive order that bars entry of individuals from certain countries in the Middle East. Now, although we have had some setbacks in courts recently, I believe that the President's actions are constitutional and that we will inevitably prevail. I also believe that the President's actions are warranted, but I am very conflicted as a man of faith. Let me share with you why. As a senior fellow of the study of law and public policy at Oxford, a few years ago, I wrote a paper entitled Turkey and the Politics of the Holocaust, which I presented at a symposium in the United Kingdom. During my research into this painful subject matter, I learned of the refugee policies of both the Americans and the British that directly resulted in the death of millions of Jews who were fleeing Nazi Europe. Now, when the Holocaust commenced in 1933, Hitler's policy was one of expulsion of Jews from Europe, not extermination. But after World War II started, when Hitler occupied most of Europe and implemented what they called the Nuremberg laws in each country, those laws deprived all Jews of all rights of citizenship with the goal of leaving them stateless and refugees. In my paper, I noted that even before the official declaration of war, the issue of refugees was already becoming an international crisis. And in 1938, delegates from 32 nations convened in France for the Evian Conference. To the astonishment of Hitler, and this is right before the war began, because the war began in 1939, Hitler sent representatives to this conference. To the astonishment of Hitler, the meetings failed to generate significant measures to resolve the Jewish refugee problem because most participant nations balked at resettling Jews in their country, which in turn reinforced Nazi propaganda that no one wanted them. What he was doing at that conference, he was telling these other countries, take the Jews or else. And he sent his representatives. Subsequent to news of Hitler's final solution, which Harry had mentioned, and the systematic murder of Jews became public, the British and the United States initiated another summit, this one in Bermuda, in April of 1943. The war was obviously well underway. Millions of Jews had already perished. And the purpose was to once again address the refugee crisis. Now, historical accounts of these meetings were unequivocal, that the real purpose of the Bermuda Conference was to silence critics of the official do-nothing policies, pay lip service to humanitarian principles, and perpetuate the status quo by stalling for time. Now, although those gatherings were held contemporaneously as the world was on notice of Hitler's blueprint to exterminate European Jewry, strikingly, it failed to produce a comprehensive rescue plan. Flash forward, 2017. So as we watch the news each day, as we go on our computer, as we read the newspapers, and we see this humanitarian crisis continue to explode in certain areas of the world, we need to stop and think about what are our Judeo-Christian principles and how should they guide us? What would we do to save lives if instead we were at St. Catherine's Greek Orthodox Church in beautiful Naples in 2017, if we were at the Evian or Bermuda conferences in the 1940s? Now, I must confess, I have to leap through a few hoops to reach my conclusion that perhaps at this point in time, despite everything I've said, that allowing refugees from certain areas of the world into the United States creates a danger that maybe America is not yet prepared to handle. I do not have confidence in the national security apparatus that is able to handle and vet a large influx of refugees from hostile environments all throughout the world. We just found out today that now ISIS is using laptop computers that they're sending with people that pose another security threat to our airline. The president's executive order gives this new administration a period of time in order to analyze the safeguards in place and make the necessary adjustments to protect the American public. Now, refugees from Syria, Iraq, and Afghanistan arrive in this nation under dramatically different circumstances than those who immigrated to our country at the turn of the century. Those who arrived from Italy, Ireland, Greece, Eastern Europe during the Holocaust were coming from cultures that embraced some semblance of Judeo-Christian morals, ethics, values, and family. Historically, people sought to come to America because of its freedoms, respect for human rights, and its unbounded opportunity. There was a purpose, a dream, and a vision This is distinctly different than the refugees that are coming out of the Middle East today. Primarily, they are leaving their countries not of their own free will, that they want to leave Syria, Iraq, or Afghanistan, but because they are being purged by persecution and civil unrest. I really see no heartfelt desire to embrace Western civilization. I may be wrong. I don't see it. I don't feel it. I don't feel that these refugees are fleeing these countries and going to Germany because they want to become Germans, or they're going to France because they want to become French, or coming to America because they want to become Americans. Now, of course, as I say that, there are many examples that are contrary to that. I've met individuals from those countries that want to become Americans, want to come here for all of our freedoms. But overall, and we're talking about sentiment, and we're talking about American policy, I think for the most part, Americans are concerned that these individuals coming from these afflicted areas, from these backgrounds, will not properly assimilate. And that's because, unfortunately, Middle Eastern Islamic societies teach intolerance, hatred, and contempt of Western values that cause me great concern of whether or not to open up our doors to waves of refugees who will not embrace our American values. Now, regardless, I feel very confident that most Muslims are not terrorists and pose no immediate danger to the United States or the other Western nations of where they arrived. But the key question is, will they be happy here and assimilate into our culture? And I think one of the things that we can look at is the chaos in some European countries, the chaos in France, the chaos in the United Kingdom, the chaos in Germany. Have those individuals from those cultures, in the Middle Eastern cultures, from Islamic backgrounds, have they properly assimilated into that nation's cultures and values, like the immigrants and those that came over during the turn of the 20th century, your forefathers, my forefathers that came from Europe, coming to America? Everybody was changing their names. They wanted to have American names. They wanted to assimilate. I could hardly get my family to talk about what went on in Europe because it was such horror for Jews coming from Eastern Europe. They didn't want to talk about it. They wanted to talk about America and our freedoms. Make no mistake about it. Sharia law is not compatible with democratic freedoms that our nation has been built upon. Sharia law violates the basic human rights, civil liberties that nations steeped in Judeo-Christian principles cherish. Now, all member states of the United Nations are supposed to adhere to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights that Mimi just mentioned. This document recognizes the inherent dignity, equality, and inalienable rights to all members of the human family. It recognizes equal rights without distinction of race, color, sex, national origin, religion, language, political opinion, or other status. And it recognizes the rights of freedom of religion, freedom of expression, freedom of speech. Now, not only does the Islamic world deviate in practice from the basic human rights provided by the UN's international legal framework, it has announced to the world that the Universal Declaration in reality means nothing when they adopted their own Universal Declaration called the Cairo Declaration of Human Rights in Islam. By express provisions, the Cairo Declaration subordinates all human rights to Sharia, both as to substance and interpretation. It repeatedly cites Sharia as the supreme and binding law. That, my friends, highlights the struggle to bridge the human rights divide between Judeo-Christian culture and Islam, right there in a nutshell. In my remaining time, I just want to touch upon various aspects of U.S. foreign policy that may give you somewhat of a background on what we've been up to in that area of the world and what we're up to now and what we can see maybe in the near future. These are relationships of strategic and economic convenience, as many Americans have figured out. Make no mistake about it, most of these countries in the Middle East, they're not our friends. Following World War I, Britain and France ruled Palestine, Egypt, Iraq, Lebanon, and Syria, amongst other countries in the Middle East, but America had no colonies in the region. So the U.S. was fairly popular, principally because we had never declared war or fought against the Ottoman Empire, and this is despite President Woodrow Wilson's support of the Balfour Declaration, which declared Britain's official support for establishing a Jewish homeland in Palestine. Now, America's interest in the Middle East would grow proportionally with its interest in oil, of course. In 1931, the Saudi king allowed Standard Oil of California, that's how we got there, Standard Oil, to search for oil in the kingdom, and the resulting discovery of vast quantities of oil propelled the Saudi king to a new level of importance in this nation where they currently remain. Saudi Arabia was the only Middle Eastern country in which America had an oil deal prior to World War II. Now, during World War II, President Roosevelt declared that the defense of Saudi Arabia was indispensable to American interests and vital to the defense of the United States. Our relationship with Saudi Arabia, despite the kingdom's policy of pitting the Americans against the British, did not take a turn for the worse until the establishment of the State of Israel. The United States attempted to smooth over the issue with the kingdom by building up the military strength of the Saudis to combat Soviet influence. We did that with many Arab countries that objected to some of our policies. We just gave them more money and more munitions. But since World War II, U.S. relations with the Middle East has really been shaped by the Cold War, by our relationship with Russia and the communists. The United States and Russia emerged from the Second World War the only two superpowers in the world. Until then, the U.S. policy in the Middle East was characterized by two goals, and these were really Eisenhower's goals: peace and stability. That was his focus. The Middle East was critical to American interests because of oil, but also because of strategic locations in the area, such as the Turkish Straits, the Persian Gulf, and of course the Suez Canal. As Russia took over Eastern Europe, the U.S. established itself as the leader of the free Western world and committed itself to checking Soviet expansion. Britain and France couldn't do it. They were too weakened from World War II. The United States reasoned that the chaos in the Middle East would allow Soviet influence to grow, whereby stability would prevent Russian inroads. Now, as Israel gradually achieved a tense peace with some of its neighbors, Egypt and Jordan, Iran and fundamentalist Islam emerged as a focal point of American attention. With the Soviet threat to American interests in that region disappearing, U.S. Middle Eastern policy was redirected from stability towards modernization. Of course, 9/11 and the subsequent fallout was a game changer. Something that I think most Americans would find interesting was that after the creation of the State of Israel, in 1948, U.S. policy was really very, very neutral towards Israel. They didn't favor Israel. They actually had more of a bent towards the Arab world. At that point in time, Israel had nothing to offer America, while the Arab world was rich in oil reserves. Now, this is right after World War II. Europe is torn up. Russia is torn up from the carnage of World War II. They needed that Arab oil badly. Israel became a state, but Israel had nothing to offer the United States. Israel was a political hot potato. Many presidents, including Truman, Eisenhower, Nixon, Ford, Carter, and of course Obama, had really conflicted relationships with the Israelis. They had better relationships with Johnson, Reagan, and Clinton, but their relationship with most U.S. presidents was very fractious. It wasn't really good. For the Israelis to get anything out of the administrations, especially the early administrations after their founding, was very, very difficult. In fact, they survived their War of Independence in 1948 and the 1967 Six-Day War in part because of the result of support, both in financial and military, from the French and the British. In fact, the Israeli nuclear weapons program was built by the French, not the Americans. Getting military support from the Americans was really like pulling teeth. And the Israelis almost lost the 1973 Yom Kippur War because the Nixon administration refused to send Israel the appropriate armaments to defend them while Russia was building up Syria and Egypt. Nixon was saying no to the Israelis. So it put them in a very tenuous situation. In the first part of the war, it looked like Israel was going to be toppled. The Nixon administration got very nervous that that would create more instability, and then they brought out the guns to support Israel. But this pro-Israel attitude out of Washington, mostly post 9/11, where George Bush realized that not only was Israel a political ally, but they were a strategic ally, is the only free and democratic nation in the Middle East. Now, from Truman to Obama, U.S. foreign policy operated on numerous flawed assumptions regarding its relationship with Israel. First, that America had to keep a proper distance from Israel in order to placate the Arabs. And second, that resolving the Israeli-Palestinian problem was the key to improving the United States' standing in the Middle East. Nothing could be further from the truth. The Arab nations are much more concerned about self-preservation than the plight of the Palestinians. Over time, it has been proven, regardless of the United States' position in support of Israel, our Arab friends who rely on us for finances and military support haven't strayed a bit. Their priorities are survival and security, not the Palestinians. It's all about self-interest. There's no better example than we see today of the strong relationship that is developed between Israel and the Sunni Muslim nations. And this is after Obama reached out to Iran, started a détente, and gave them a pathway to a nuclear weapon. So Israel and these Sunni nations, behind the scenes, have significant cooperation in terms of intelligence and military aspects. And this is despite the fact that the Palestinian conflict with the Israelis has worsened, and the hopes for a two-state solution are vanishing every day. The enemy of my enemy is my friend. Just some final random thoughts on U.S. policy. I really liked George W. Bush, so I'll be charitable. The decision to invade Iraq, if we look back, needed to have been reconsidered. The result has been a destruction of an historic nature and the purging of ancient Christian communities, not only in Iraq, but then in Egypt and Syria. The decision then to abandon Iraq by Obama, in turn, created ISIS. We turned the entire region and country upside down. We announced we're leaving. We create this vacuum of culture and ethnic groups who have been waiting for hundreds of years to get at each other. And this is what turned up. Terrible. The nuclear deal with Iran further destabilized the region by putting the entire Sunni world on edge as they contemplate seeking nuclear capabilities. The root of all evil, according to me and my policy analysis in the Middle East, can be traced to Saudi Arabia and Iran. They are the major exporters of terrorism, but of a different nature. The Iranians, with their military and nuclear capabilities, continue to threaten the region and provide tangible military and logistical support for terrorist organizations like Hezbollah, Hamas, and the Houthis in Yemen. The Saudis, on the other hand, export the most fundamentalist version of Islam, Wahhabism, which provides the theological underpinning for the terrorist organizations such as Al-Qaeda and ISIS. Now, like most of you, I have no idea where this administration is going on this issue. I don't. Hopefully it's going to be in a more constructive way than the past administration. But I will tell you, we have fumbled the ball from administration to administration in the Middle East. And it's not only cost Americans their lives, it's cost Christians and innocent Muslims all over the world their lives. The public policy, the foreign policy of the United States in this area is critically important to the entire world. And although we're not the world's policeman, as some people like to say, I will tell you, because the ACLJ is an international law firm. We have offices in Strasbourg, France, where the European Court of Human Rights is, Jerusalem, Pakistan, Moscow, and various other forums. I will tell you, when we go over to these places, They need clarity and leadership from the United States. These countries don't move, they follow. The United States is a large country. The only countries that are larger are China and India. I mean, there's 320, 330 million people here. The largest European country is Germany with about 85, 86 million people. You could put Germany, France, the UK together, they're not as large as the United States. They are looking to see what we are doing. We have to lead, and we have to start making well thought out decisions in this arena. I encourage you to stay informed and engaged. And I think this Christian Rights and Freedom Institute that's been developed out of this church and the support that the community has given it is so critical. And I wish I pray that this could be franchised really throughout the country, because American citizens really need to know what's going on. And it's not about Republican or Democrat. It's about saving lives. It's about saving and protecting lives and standing up for freedom of speech, freedom of expression, freedom of religion, and protecting America. Thank you.
Stuart, thank you so very much. And now I'd like to invite Andrew Taylor to address our symposium. And Andrew just has this incredible knowledge of Syria, and the length of time that he has spent studying and being in that country adds a lot of drama to the already pretty large drama that Syria is and has become. So during the period of time that he's been there, and with all that history, it sort of became the meat in a club sandwich surrounded by Iran and Russia. Russian dressing became very popular the other day in the news. But trust me, he can do it. So please welcome Andrew for a very unique view of Syria and the crushing blow dealt on human rights in that nation.
Thank you, Mimi, and thanks very much to all of you for both organizing this event today as well as attending. I'll start out, like all good things, from the deal with the Middle East, from the personal to the professional. So I know what almost all of you are thinking. Who's this guy? How did he end up spending so much time in Syria? And why should I be listening to him? Well, just for completely reasons of disclosure, I'm a white guy from Western Pennsylvania. I'm not related to anybody in the Middle East. I'm Methodist by background, but I don't practice very often. I believe in God, and I consider myself a Christian. I got involved in the Middle East because I wanted to. The Cold War had just ended. I had just spent time in what was then East Germany. I saw the wall come down almost before my eyes, and in an earlier day I would have been a Sovietologist. Instead, when I was in college, we went to war in the Middle East, and I started studying about the Middle East, had a series of fellowships that took me to study at the American University in Cairo, and then after that, like every good graduate experience, you get bored, and I started working as a newspaper editor in Cairo, and I lived in the Middle East for about 15 years. I lived in Egypt, Turkey, Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, Israel, the Gulf, and Tunisia for long extended periods of time. Around the year 2000, I was based out of Beirut, which is a great place to visit, except when there's a war. And my company, then Oxford Business Group, asked me, because of my language skills and some other and maybe political skills, I don't know, to go over the mountain, 2-hour drive into Damascus. The Iron Man dictator of Syria, Hafez al-Assad, had just died, and his son Bashar had taken power. He was promising the world in terms of reforms, so I was assigned to Syria to record those reforms and to see where things could really go. Unfortunately, things did not go according to plan at all, and we ended up in the current mess that we're in here today. So I'm going to explain a little bit about how the Syrian war came about, right, and a little bit about what it's generated and how that might affect some of the communities that I know you care about in the Middle East and also here in the United States. So I call this presentation the game changer. I speak from slides. I usually, and I don't speak from notes. And I'm going to leave this slide deck with you for, because I know you like to study, you all like to read, and perhaps it'll give you a good baseline for your further study of Syria and the Middle East. Syria's civil war and its implications for the Middle East and the West. Okay. Wait a minute. I like to point it towards the projector. With the projector? Oh, sorry. Okay, sorry. Okay, so this is a map of Syria. These are the different muhafaza, or governorates inside of Syria. So when you hear about an attack in Aleppo, you can see where it is in the north, in Damascus in the south. Generally, these are good reference points to follow any kind of news reports you have coming out of Syria. Syria was, here in the center, produced after the collapse of the Ottoman Empire at the end of the First World War. It was carved out by what was known as the Sykes-Picot Agreement of 1916, which had its 100th anniversary last year. And it was divided. The Middle East was generally divided between British and French interests, but also there were zones for Russia, for Greece, and for Italy, and a number of countries beyond. So let's go a little over the sectarian and ethnic demography of Syria. So Syria has a population of roughly 22 million people. It's a majority Sunni country, about 75% of the population. But when people start throwing around terms like Sunni or Shia or Christian or whatever it is, you should be aware of this a little bit, because the situation is a little bit more complex. In the case of Syria, the Sunni community is large, but it's incredibly divided. You have the Urbane Sunnis of Damascus and Aleppo. Those are ones that probably some of you might have had contact with. They speak foreign languages. They drink alcohol. They have a westernized lifestyle. Then you have the tribal Sunnis of eastern Syria, where ISIS is now located. The settled tribes of the Hauran south of Damascus, which is now an opposition-controlled area. You have the conservative Sunnis of northwest Syria in Idlib and Hama province, where you have the presence today of al-Qaeda. You have Kurds in the northeastern and environs of Aleppo, northeastern Syria and the environs of Aleppo, and then you have coastal Sunnis as well. Now, Syria also has a sizable minority population, roughly 12% of the population, but it's believed to be much less now, are Alawites, the Assad and Makhlouf families, which are at the core of the Assad regime, which I'll speak about in a moment, hail from this sect. It's a heterodox offshoot of Shia Islam. They're primarily secular in terms of their lifestyle, but can be considered within the Shia spectrum. And then we, of course, have a sizable Christian population, about 10%, Eastern Orthodox, Assyrian, Syriac, and of course we also have some smatterings of Catholics and so on. Then we, of course, we have Druze, Ismailis, and Twelver Shia, which represent about 3% of the population. Sorry. Okay. When they carved up Syria, when the French tried to put this modern nation state together out of the Ottoman Empire, they were trying to combat what was called the vilayet system. It's the nation system under the Ottoman Empire. Empires have real advantages. Well, they have disadvantages. Oftentimes they're not representative. They charge high taxes. They haul your sons and sometimes daughters off to fight wars that they don't care about. But they have some advantages in that oftentimes they give local communities a lot of autonomy, right? And this ebbs and flows over time. And certainly with the Ottoman Empire, that occurred. So the country that France tried to make, the modern nation state of Syria, was divided here between the different sects that I just outlined, were throughout the country like a mosaic, like a puzzle, right? So it was very difficult to find absolutely homogeneous areas of Syria. So not only is the Sunni community divided, but the minority communities are also scattered throughout the country, right? And this is an original French colonial map. So these were the original drawings from the end of the First World War. The French experimented with different configurations in Syria. One was the united Syria we have today, or at least on the map. Then this is the divided Syria, where you have the Alawite country on the coast, and that's where the Alawites come from, the state of Aleppo in the north, Damascus in the south, and then Jebel Druze for the Druze population in the south. Notice very importantly, and this will get to Bilal's presentation, there's no Kurdish region, which is noteworthy. Okay, so actually, let me just raise this a little bit. Syria seems really unstable now, is the epicenter of a huge crisis, which we'll talk about, but it's long been a big problem. Actually, after independence in 1946, Syria was the world's most unstable country, which is really saying something. At least 7 different coups d'etats. Syria ceased to exist between 1958 and 1961, when it merged with Egypt under Gamal Abdel Nasser and formed the United Arab Republic. So what happened with the majority Sunni population, which primarily ruled over Syria, with every coup d'etat, the Sunni leaders oftentimes had to leave the country, but also their allies. So over time, their associates were purged, had to go into exile. And so they were unable to see the forest through the trees, and the only real power left in the country, at least anything that could be politically used, were the Alawites in the military. They had been brought into the military by the French. They had traditionally been the most, I would say, one of the most persecuted minorities in what was Syria, and they were sort of the last ones standing. And they helped the Ba'ath Party come to power in a coup in March 8th, 1963, which launched what was called it's the Ba'athist Revolution, but in the end became an avenue for what is known as minority domination of Syria. Now, Hafez al-Assad, Bashar al-Assad's father, tried to change this situation. He took power in a bloodless coup in November of 1970. Hafez al-Assad was a brutal man. He was also a very intelligent man. He launched what was called the corrective revolution. He knew that Alawites and other minorities were not enough to rule over Syria. 25% of the population is not only not representative in terms of trying to administer a government, but it would be very difficult without facing a large insurgency. So he gathered around 2 parts of the Sunni community around him. One were the urbane Sunnis of Damascus and Aleppo and the trading families. He also added the tribal Sunnis of eastern Syria, the Jazeera area, and also those from south of Damascus. Now, what all of these different Sunni groupings had in common is that they all had a traditional rivalry with the conservatives of northwest Syria, Aleppo and Idlib. So Hafez al-Assad understood very well the principle of divide and rule. And he gathered these Sunnis around these minorities and around the Alawites, and for a while the system stabilized. But it didn't last that long. Repression only lasts until, in limited ways, until it finally collapses upon itself. Between 1970 and 1979, Syria saw some stability, but over time the Muslim Brotherhood, an organization from particularly northwestern Syria, waged a terrorist war against the regime. And what I'm not talking about here anything, I'm talking about in terms of assassinations, bombings of ministries, and so on. And then finally there was a battle with the regime. In February of 1982, the Syrian regime surrounded Syria's 4th largest city of Hama and opened up with artillery. Around between 10 and 30,000 Syrians or more were killed, mostly Sunnis. And I think the best account of this, if you're ever interested in it, is Thomas Friedman's book From Beirut to Jerusalem. There's a chapter called Hama Rules, and he's one of the few people who wrote on this period of time. And that's a picture of Hama after the barrage. So what happened is that in the 10 years after the Hama massacre, Syria was placed on lockdown. People weren't allowed to travel. Most opponents of the regime, whether they were members of the Muslim Brotherhood or they were communists or Arab nationalists or anyone who looked cross-eyed at Assad, was arrested and put into prison, and they threw away the key. The foreign currency in the country dried up, and essentially everybody, men and women, all across the country, just stayed home. Now, what happens when men and women stay home with nothing else better to do and no good TV? Right, population growth. There's another intermediate step in there we won't discuss in church. Okay? Right. In the 10 years following the Hama massacre of 1982, Syria was among the 20 fastest growing populations on the planet. sub-Saharan African levels of reproduction, particularly among the Sunni Arab populations from rural areas. Right? And that's the reason why, when you look at some of those horrific videos you see coming out of Syria, notice the hair color and the beard color increasingly. Jet black, not much gray there, right? Essentially, what happened over time was that the people born after that initial, the initial massacre of Hama, and were born during that period of time, what you're witnessing, ladies and gentlemen, is authoritarian karma. All of those people born during that period of time, born during extensive sadness, are trying to evoke revenge against the regime and trying to fight and to topple today Bashar al-Assad's government. Now, this didn't have to be this way, right? There's a saying Amish have in Pennsylvania, where I'm from, there's no such thing as only one way, right? And at the time when I went over to Syria, we thought that Bashar al-Assad and his wife in particular, who I knew personally, would have the good common sense to realize the numbers were against them. And actually, the regime did know the numbers were against them. Asma al-Assad and the UN launched a plan to catalog all of these population growths, the movement of people, the level of displacement, the lack of job creation. But in the end, the regime, the Alawite regime, for reasons I can get into a little bit later, proved completely incapable of reform. Most of it had to do not only with the associations within it, but also with corruption. It proved too rigid to address reforms of population explosion, and had a couple of things that were going against it. A plunge in oil production of about 30%. These large demographic waves born after 1982 started hitting Syria's labor markets, particularly rural Sunnis. The regime couldn't expand the public sector in the country to create enough jobs. And desperate for foreign direct investment and job creation, the Assad regime began to talk about reforms internationally, ask for foreign direct investment, but were proved unable to launch the kind of reforms that were necessary. And in the end, the regime began to buckle. So the Assad regime structure here, just very quickly, you have Assad at the core, the Makhlouf Shalish families, the security services in the army, and the Ba'ath Party that is in the National Assembly. This is the regime structure, just for your knowledge. You will find there's a color code up there for Alawites, Sunnis, and other. And then the red lines are blood relations, the white lines are other relations. So as you know, I think, the Arab uprisings began in the spring of late 2010, the spring of 2011. In Syria, they started in the southern part of the country, when a few children scrawled on a wall, "The people want to follow the regime." The regime came and arrested those children, took them to Damascus, didn't tell their families where they were from. It was a kind of a bonehead move, frankly, because that area of Syria was Sunni, but they were always loyal to the regime. They were some of those that were brought in the regime by Hafiz al-Assad. So the thing that proved that the spark of the uprising was that the people from this part of Syria are and I have many friends from southern Syria, they're hotheads. They don't take things lying down. They began to protest. The regime came out, started using live gunfire. And with every funeral the next day would come another protest. And with every protest would come more government repression. The uprising spread throughout the country. And with that, the regime moved up the escalation chain, first from the use of live gunfire, machine gun fire, cannon fire, mortars, artillery, and then into strategic weapons, Scud missiles. It's the second largest firing of Scud missiles on civilian populations ever. And then, of course, what you all know Syria for, the use of chemical agents, not just in the Ghouta attack of the summer of 2013, but on multiple occasions that have been cataloged by the United Nations. An absolutely horrific situation. With that, with those choices, the country quickly devolved into a multi-sectarian civil war with the regime in the red here in the west. They roughly control, this was in 2016, this is the map of today. Today, Syria, the Syrian regime controls a little bit north of a third of Syrian territory in the west. The green areas here in the south and so on, these are controlled by the opposition. The white areas are controlled by Al-Qaeda. The black areas are controlled by ISIS. And in the northeastern part of the Syrian Chartreuse, across the southern border of Turkey, today you have the Kurdish regions of the country. So The mosaic that was born out of the Ottoman Empire has in many ways returned during the course of the Syrian civil war. Now, just for accounting purposes, we mostly focus on ISIS because of its atrocities, and we should. I've had friends who were decapitated, and not before my eyes, but on film, and I'm very sorry for that. And they were great guys. But we have to recognize that the lion's share of violence, and I mean the lion's share, the original meaning of lion's share, which is almost all, is due to Assad regime activities in the country. Right? This is a rough estimate up through March of 2016. The use of those strategic weapons have been enormously damaging. Also, what's very interesting is not only are they responsible for the majority of violence in Syria, but the Assad regime is responsible for almost all the displacement. For all of ISIS's purposes, with the exception of minorities, ISIS is very good at getting its populations to stay in their areas. So minorities have to run for their lives, but others they encourage them to stay, right? And that's just a fact of the conflict. Does it mean that what ISIS is doing is less bad than the Assad regime? No, but we have to look at the scale. And it is these activities that have created the largest humanitarian disaster since the Second World War. Okay, I know that Mimi wanted me to touch a little bit about Russia. By the spring of 2015. The Assad regime began losing territory very rapidly. Russia came in to support the Assad regime in August of September. They have used a light footprint, limited aircraft strikes, around 2,000 troops, although there are some other special forces in the country. They've kept Assad in power, and over the last 2 years have helped the regime gain about 5 to 7% of Syrian territory. That has involved extensive bombing of opposition areas and caused the fleeing of civilian populations, and now provide air cover for Shia militias that are fighting on behalf of Assad in alliance with Iran. So as I mentioned, in terms of looking at it at a national scale for the U.S., largest humanitarian disaster since the Second World War, we have the problem of stability of U.S. allies. In rough terms, just to give you in terms of what you hear about refugees, you see refugees. So the number of refugees in Jordan today, in rough, broad brushstrokes, is as if the entire population of Canada came to the United States. Which sounds pretty bad, right? Except it's not the worst example. In the case of Lebanon, the percentage of the Syrian population now living there is as if the entire population of Mexico came to the United States. Okay. Turkey, which has the majority of refugees, has a much larger population, a lot more resources. So it's those kind of comparisons don't exactly work. But if you're wondering why people are showing up on Europe's doorsteps, it is due to that displacement, the carrying out of the war, that this crisis has unfolded. It set off this migrant crisis that we have in Europe and beyond. And of course, what has happened is that as the migrant crisis, which is primarily created by the Assad regime, created more and more people flooding out of the country, ISIS and Al-Qaeda grew in the opposition ranks as the United States stayed out of the war, right? And President Obama was quite famous about his position on staying out of the Syrian war, staying out of another war like Iraq. When these two streams crossed, so to speak, not to cite from the film Ghostbusters, it became supercharged and became incredibly damaging politically in Europe, and I would argue even in the United States. Okay, overall numbers, about 500,000 dead, 250,000 in detention, 12 million displaced. We have huge issues and epidemics in public health. We have an entire generation of Syrians not educated, and we have a complete lack of financial support. Most of the time, the financial support for refugees is around 20%. Here's the rough estimates for the refugees. Sorry, I skipped ahead. Migrant crisis in terms of Syrians flooding to Europe and beyond. Probably the political outcome of this is as more migrants have headed to Europe and extremists have tried to infiltrate their ranks, we need to make a distinction here. The refugees who are fleeing from Syria are in need and deserve our help, no matter their faith, right? They are being taken advantage of by extremists who don't deserve our support, That's a big distinction, right? And many of them, if not most of them, are Muslims. And the problem is that ISIS and Al-Qaeda take advantage of these. And they take advantage and they put us in a very difficult position as Christians, I think, in that you can't end up solving the Amish riddle. And the Amish riddle is, how do you know a good man from a bad man when you meet them? When you meet him. You can't, of course. You have to watch what he does. So the point is not that these people are Muslims. The problem is that we can't identify without greater periods of time and greater checks who, in terms, comes with genuine needs as refugees and those who have a extremist agenda. And that's a very difficult riddle to solve. We're trying to. It's going to take a lot of time. Europe, by far now, has accepted most of the refugees. In terms of the impact on minorities on Syria, in Syria, I think minorities in Syria are in a stark dilemma. On the one hand, as the Assad regime has collapsed, they have huddled around the Assad regime, as they had been doing for several decades, in order to defend themselves. And I don't blame them for doing so. Going over to the opposition ranks, oftentimes, although there have been a number of Christians that have gone over to the opposition, has been increasingly dangerous. In many of these communities, particularly ISIS communities and Al-Qaeda communities in these areas they control, are intolerant of these minorities. But at the same time, and you can talk to your Christian friends who live in the region, just ask them what Assad's political plan is to get out of this problem. And they'll tell you the same thing I learned when I went to Syria. He doesn't have one, right? And so minority populations, like Christians, are caught in this horrible dilemma where demographics are dramatically now stacked against them, and we see the continued exit of minorities from Syria and elsewhere in the Middle East, right? So this is a story of Syria, but it's a story that has been replicated across the Middle East. And it's a difficult one to solve. Sorry. ISIS durable safe havens have grown up throughout the country. Al-Qaeda has been gaining as a result of U.S. Lack of intervention and diplomacy with Russia. Probably the big story at the moment is, on the western part of the country, is that because the Assad regime has no reform is unable to reform and has chosen this way to shoot its way out of the uprising, it can't recruit men into the army. They only have about 18,000 deployable forces in the entire country, according to the latest military estimates. And not the entire army, but those forces that can go out and take new territory. So what they're doing is they're importing Shia militia and Hezbollah in unprecedented numbers into Syria. Now it's north of about 50,000 Shia militiamen. And of course, Bilal will get into this, this has led to the growth also of, in terms of territory, the chartreuse areas of the map controlled by the PYD in Syria, which is an offshoot of the PKK, a U.S. designated terrorist organization. And that's something I'll let Bilal touch on and get into. We have a number of policy options before us, and I'll conclude with this. There's been a lot of talk about limited buffer zones or safe havens. The reasons for that are people want to provide for refugees in their country. If you ban Syrians from coming to the United States or other countries, it begs the question, well, where the hell should they go? Right? So if they're going to stay home and they're going to be able to go inside of Syria, then they would have to be protected. Right? And that's something that the West and the international community has been reticent to do. Right now there's been a number of discussions about safe havens. The other policy option over the last year have been strikes on the Assad regime for ceasefire violations. Assad regime has violated the ceasefire on a number of occasions, then the opposition violates it, and so on. That's another course. No-fly zones, those have been debated. And then there's, of course, probably the U.S. post-Iraq war favorite option, and that is status quo. Do nothing militarily, talk with the Russians, provide aid, and hope the situation improves, which, of course, as you know, has not occurred. And with that, I'll conclude, and I'll hand things back to Mimi and then over to Bilal. Thank you.
I hate to do that every time. Andrew, thank you so very much. And now I'd like to ask Bilal Wahab to come up and speak to us. He's going to bring us a different view of this troubled region, and from his native Iraq and the struggle to fight the worst of ISIS, the role played by the Peshmerga defending Erbil, the genocide against the Yazidis for their faith, and what role Turkey is now playing as she moves away from the United States and joins Russia in this region. And we'd like to know if the Kurds are potential allies today for the United States. So to answer that question is Bilal Wahab. Bilal.
I'm a professor by trade, and I cannot stand still. So if you don't mind, I'm just going to move around. Well, thank you very much for having me. I'm truly...
There's a video camera, and you can't move too much.
Okay. Sorry. I'll try to stand somewhat still. It's a pleasure and honor to be here. Thank you very much for having me. The conversations that I've had so far have been amazing and enlightening. So thank you very much. And thank you all for coming and listening to us. I want to kick this off by asking you a question. 2 questions. 1, what comes to your mind? Just throw a word when I say Kurd or Kurdish. Let me hear some. Minority? Pardon me? Kurdistan. Well-governed. Well-governed. Thank you.
Turkish enemy.
Okay. Okay. What else do I hear? Fighters. Yes. Oil is new. I heard something here as well. Pardon me? Pro-American. Very positive. Thank you. Let me get 2 more. Kurdish. Yes, ma'am. Anti-Turkish. We need to work on that. Yes, sir. Suppressed minority in Turkey along the lines of anti-Turkish, or maybe Turks are anti-Kurdish. Okay, I'll get to that. Yes, ma'am. I heard one more around this corner. Looking for their own boundaries for a country. I beg your pardon. Looking for their own boundaries as a country. Yes. 3 different nations. Absolutely. And that's actually one of the main themes of my talk today. Let me ask you my second question. Have you met, well, part A, have you met a Kurd before? Raise your hand if you have. All right, I'm doing something about that today. Have you met a Muslim before? Okay, that's awesome. So I'm just going to focus on the Kurdish side then. So I wanted to talk about the largest minority group of the Middle East, since minority is one of the themes of this symposium. The Kurds have lost their bid for statehood ever since the Middle East, the post-Ottoman Middle East, was carved out into smaller nation states. And therefore the history of the Kurds has been characterized by division mainly across 4 countries. If nations were built around ethnic groups, then this would be sort of the map of the Middle East. The overlay that you see here, this sort of shaded area, that would be Kurdistan. That's where the Kurds of the Middle East live. Now the Kurds are of Aryan race, and the language Kurdish, which comes in multiple languages, mainly Kurmanji and Sorani, is an Indo-European language. So, a distinct ethnic group. I'm not Arab, I'm not Turkish, I'm not Persian. I am Kurdish, quite distinct. But in the bid for statehood, we just lost it. Now I can go through the blame game of, do we blame, the French or the Brits, the colonizers at the time? Do we blame, French wine and cheese because it was by Mr. Sykes and Mr. Picot? When they doodled through a map of the Middle East and maybe they forgot to make a country for Kurdistan. The blame game can go inwards on the Kurds for not being united, not really knowing what they know. I think some of that blame continues, today. So at the end of the day, we lost that bit. And therefore, the history and the story of the Kurds is not just one story, but 4 different stories with subcategories within them. We have, I'm just going to show some photos here, just to guide some of these histories. So the largest ethnic Kurdish group is in Turkey. It's about 15 to 17 million Kurds live in Turkey. And by the way, by population, if I were to ask you, what is the largest Kurdish town in terms of population? It would be, want to make a guess? It would be Istanbul. Yes, it would be Istanbul. The largest number of Kurds live in Istanbul. Larger than Diyarbakir, larger than even Erbil, which is the capital of the Iraqi Kurdistan region. Now the Kurds of Turkey, with the creation of the nation, back to your points, and several of you mentioned the relationship between the Kurds and the Turks as not being a positive one. It's because the modern nation of Turkey did not recognize the existence of the Kurds. We've been called Turks of the mountain. We've been called more derogatory words. The use and the speaking, singing in Kurdish was a crime for a while in modern Turkish history. Of course, with time and with struggle, with more understanding of both sides, with some fighting on both sides, some of that have changed in recent times. Now, Kurdish is not a banned language. With some of the reforms that the current Turkish government has started, for the first time in Turkish history, there's a Kurdish channel, there were Kurdish political parties, some Kurdish was taught in schools. Unfortunately, some of these reforms have been rolled back, but nonetheless, it's been a tortuous history. Of course, the most important element in terms of the stability and security of the Middle East is the war between the Turkish government, Turkish military, and the Kurdish guerrilla group called the PKK. The English translation is the Kurdistan Workers' Party. It's a Maoist socialist political party that started an armed struggle against the Turkish military. Now, because Turkey is a NATO ally and an ally of the United States, and Turkey designates the PKK as a terrorist group, the United States also designates PKK as a terrorist group. I'm going to skip Iraq for a second and go to Syria. I'm going to come back to Iraq because the story of Syria and Turkey's Kurds have all of a sudden become very much interrelated, as Andrew alluded to. The Kurds of Syria had a different experience. Some of them were co-opted into the regime and they had citizenship rights. But around 600,000 Kurds of Syria were not recognized as citizens. And that comes with, it's not like just being an illegal immigrant, in a country like the United States, where you have an economy outside of the government doesn't control everything. In a socialist country like Syria was, which is, the Ba'ath Party stands for, the Socialist Arab Nationalist Party. So when you're not a citizen, then you're not eligible for education, for public health, for public jobs. So you basically become a second or a third grade citizen. And this was the plight of the Kurds, not even recognized as citizens in their own country. One of the first things that Assad did in order to appease that segment of society after the revolution was to grant them a blank citizenship, with a national decree. Think of it as an executive order that everyone is now a citizen. But until the revolution of 2011, these Kurds did not have citizenship. But what happened, this is the Middle East, remember that the enemy of my enemy is my friend. The PKK that was outlawed in Turkey was given refuge in Syria by the Assad regime. The founder and leader of the PKK took refuge inside Syria. And that group is nowadays called, the offshoot of the PKK is called the PYD. And they have an armed group called the YPG. We're getting to the soup already, right? The alphabet soup? All right. So the YPG is this fighting force that you have been, watching on TV screens and reading about in the front pages. Fierce fighters, men and women, very good force against ISIS. They're fearless, they fight hard, they protected their own towns, their own communities. And of course, the United States, for all the politics that Andrew so eloquently discussed earlier, not wanting to send in troops and fight the fight, it relied on these Kurds to curb ISIS and fight ISIS back. Now, of course, these kind of alliances and cooperations with a local group, and of course the most powerful country in the world, it does not just, stay military. It creates political aspirations. So the Kurds of Syria have now carved out the northern Syria, and I'm going to show you a map, the northern and eastern side of Syria. They protect it. Well, they're mainly Kurdish populated, not necessarily exclusively Kurdish populated. It's being protected by the Kurds. It's being liberated from ISIS by the Kurds. And that really creates, a notion, maybe we should stick around here and create our own Kurdish government. So that's what's going on in Syria. The complications there is that Turkey is #1 enemy of this entity. Why? Because this group in Syria is mostly tied to the PKK in Turkey. So linguistically, they're closer. Ideologically, they're sort of an offshoot of the PKK group. So if you're sitting in Ankara, you're gonna lose some sleep over a Kurdish state emerging on your border. And now, of course, these Kurds, although their ambition lies within Syria, they're also afraid because the only power that is bent on ending this ambition, this dream becoming a reality, are the Turks. So in a way, they're both right. It's like a prisoner's dilemma, it's like a vicious cycle. They both are afraid of each other, and together they create a very highly volatile situation. And this is an area, for example, for the United States to play a role, because the United States is one of the major actors, because I can't say the only actor that has leverage with both the Turks and the Kurds of Syria. Let me move to the Kurds of Iraq. Some of the pictures that you see here are about Kurds of Iraq. I'm a Kurd from Iraq. I grew up in Erbil. I was educated in the United States. But our history with an Arab nation, especially after Saddam Hussein came to power, and is also an Arab nationalist party. So by nature, it's Arab. So as a Kurd, you're immediately in the second grade, in the second level, second stature of citizenship. So that's one. In the beginning of the country, the Kurds were in the government. But then the Kurds also wanted more rights. And of course, when you push for more rights, sometimes the reaction is brutal. And just like Syria's Bashar Assad's reaction to the Kurds, Saddam Hussein has been brutal against the Kurds. I know what chemical weapon smells like. I survived it. I lived 5 years in a refugee camp in Iran because we were all kicked out. I saw my grandma's house being destroyed. An entire neighborhood in, in some of the towns, like the town of Halabja that was gassed in 1988, you could walk on the roofs of an entire neighborhood because they were all level to the ground. So the roof is now the ground, so you can walk, an entire mile on homes' roofs. This has been, unfortunately, the kind of oppression that Iraqi Kurds have suffered. Let alone, so here you have the picture, I think this one, yeah. So that's a picture of Halabja being gassed in 1988. 5,000 people were killed on the spot on the same day. This is a picture of mass graves that we keep finding in the Iraqi deserts, because from 1984 to 1989, there was a campaign called the Anfal, in which Saddam Hussein committed genocide against the Kurds. And the genocide was basically any man of fighting age would be killed. And a lot of times they were not even worth the bullets, so they would just be buried alive. That's why we find these mass graves even nowadays. 4,000 villages were destroyed. And the people, the men of fighting age, were taken to these killing fields, and then the men and women were put in concentration camps. And now many of these concentration camps now have become, new towns and new homes, because it's easier to control a few towns than control 4,000 villages. And of course, the whole idea, this is in the context of the Iran-Iraq war, and of course, these villages and towns were providing not only shelter for the Kurdish Peshmerga that were fighting the Iraqi government, but Saddam Hussein always was afraid that these might be, grounds for the Iranians to come and attack Iraq. So in the context of war, all of these atrocities were committed. Now, the reason that some of these stories came to light after Iraq invaded Kuwait in 1990 was because at the time, Saddam Hussein was seen as an ally of the United States. It was it took Iraq to invade Kuwait, actually, for the United States to admit that it was Iraq that gassed the Kurds. Otherwise, Iraq, the United States bought into Iraq's story that actually the gassing took place at the hand of the Iranians. My point is that sometimes humanitarian stories get lost or get misinterpreted in the politics, and it's very important to keep our eyes open, to, keep the eye on the prize, and this is human rights and the value of the human life. Fast forward, we see a statue of Saddam Hussein falling. That's a cover from 1991 when the Kurdish uprising happened. And of course, President Bush Sr. asked the Iraqis to rise against the regime. We did, but there was no one to come for the defense, and that was only a couple of years after the gassing. So there was the Kurdish exodus, the mass exodus of the Kurds, in which the entire population basically fled into Iran and into Turkey. But of course, at the time, the media had still the credibility and the power to change attitudes. So CNN crew was there. And they filmed this, and that created, the kind of support that we're hoping, to get through these conversations for the humanitarian cause, and that created a safe zone, literally called the no-fly zone, in which created a safe haven for the Kurds, and that's how the Kurdish government of Iraq was created, and the Kurds have survived and thrived. And of course, that takes us to 2003, when the boogeyman was finally taken care of. And, you can call it occupation, you can call it a mistake, you can call it whatever you want, to be politically correct or incorrect, be a Democrat, be a Republican. For the Kurds, it was a liberation. It was justice coming, albeit late. And by the way, that's why the Kurds, love Americans, and they also forget about, some of the earlier histories, like the 1991 abandonment, letting the Iraqi troops coming back. And of course, earlier on in 1974, when the US State Department orchestrated a peace between the Shah of Iran and Saddam Hussein that put an end to the Kurdish uprising, because the Iranian government was helping a Kurdish uprising against Saddam Hussein, and the Americans supported this. But when Saddam Hussein offered the concessions that the US wanted Iraq to make, then the Kurds were abandoned. But you made up for that in 2003. So, Kurdistan region of Iraq now has oil and is also a bulwark against ISIS in the fight against ISIS. And you've all heard of the bravery of the Kurds, of how reliable a partner the Kurdish Peshmerga, which Peshmerga is the word to describe a Kurdish fighter, which means those who face death. It's kind of a very efficient anti-ISIS motto, although we had it before ISIS. So now if you look at where ISIS is, which is sort of the second point of my presentation today, ISIS posed a threat not only to Iraq and Syria, but also to the Kurds. This is a more recent map in which ISIS has been rolled back, because as you can see, there are still pockets of ISIS inside Iraq, and of course swaths of land still controlled by ISIS inside Syria. So it has been a threat to the Kurds. But it has also been an opportunity for Kurdish ambitions to translate into what they have missed ever since the Middle East was carved out, which is statehood. In Iraq, the region is oiling its way toward independence. Quite literally. Iraqi Kurdistan is a safe haven for not only the Kurds, but also for the internally displaced people and the minorities. It's a region where there is religious diversity, ethnic diversity. And some of you, thank you, some of you did mention that. It's a minority that takes care of other minorities. Now, I would be the first to tell you, it's democracy with a lot of problems. Its economy is developing. It has a lot of problems. My writing is about how to fix those problems. But in the Middle Eastern context, it's a success story of the value of consistent US engagement. The United States has been engaging the Kurdish region, not with 100,000 troops and not with 0 troops, but with enough amount of engagement. When in danger, the US came to our protection. When we had the Civil War, they came and brought our leaders to Washington, D.C. and had them kiss and make up. When we had, when we wanted to become a democracy, they helped us build some institutions. US commitment with patience pays off. And Iraqi Kurdistan is an example of how that kind of patience can pay off. And there are lessons that could be maybe elicited from the Kurdish experience for what's going on for Iraq after ISIS and maybe also for Syria. This is the Syrian side of what might become, a Kurdish entity. It's a larger question whether there will be an independent state, whether there will be a region within a federated country. But this is where the Kurds of Syria have carved out, a safe haven for the Kurds, in which minorities participate in governing and participate in the defense, but it is dominated by the Kurds. So I call it two Kurdistans because there's an opportunity for the historical sort of injustice against the Kurds to be maybe corrected in the case of Syria and in the case of Iraq. Bringing them and uniting them together, it's more complicated. I'd be happy to address, if you have any questions about this, maybe in the Q&A. Let me spend 2 minutes talk about the IDP, which stands for Internally Displaced People, and the refugee crisis in Iraq. The dots that you can see here, the green dots are IDP camps. The blue dots are refugee camps, and then the sort of lighter shades are ones that are under construction. You see a lot of dots here. And by the way, the majority of the IDPs and refugees don't even live in camps. They live in the cities with people. There's a town near my hometown called Shaqlawa. 60% of the population are either refugees or IDPs. They're now the majority. To give you some numbers, there are 1.3 million Iraqis, okay, who have fled, ISIS war, fled Mosul, fled Fallujah, fled Ramadi, and this is starting in 2014. And of course, as I mentioned, many don't live in refugees where it's easier to get international aid to them. They live in the cities, which means they are also adding a pressure on the public services, on schools. I mean, the size of classrooms doubled, the hospital beds. For example, when the war happened, when the war took place in the fight against, to retake Mosul, there were not enough beds in the hospitals for the wounded in the war. Why? Because there is added pressure on the hospital. It's not every day that you can build a new hospital. The Kurdish region, if you look at percentage, I think Andrew had much better statistics saying that, if we did that, Lebanon does or Jordan does. I have 38% here, so maybe you can do the math. If the United States admitted as many IDPs and refugees as Iraqi Kurdistan did, how many people would be here? I think that would be something like 110 million people, right? Yeah, I'm not very good with math, I can talk about Kurds, but not the math. 1 + 1 depends on the weather. What ISIS is doing is considered genocide, but to me, this is the story. This is, and of course, the question of the minorities here, my last point, is that, Iraq used to have, in 2003, 1.4 million Christians. And now that has unfortunately come down to 250, which probably are waiting for the day to leave. The Yazidis, which is another minority of Kurdish ethnicity, but the religion is not Islam, it also went down from about 700,000 to 500,000. Of course, you've all heard of the atrocities committed against the Yazidis. I guess a couple of concluding points here is, one, maybe the fear of IDPs and refugees, of the other coming into your town, shouldn't be as frightening. I think we gave you statistics about some of the countries in the region that have welcomed these sort of foreigners into their land, but we're not hearing about daily explosions or suicide bombers in these towns. None of the IDPs and the refugees that are in Kurdistan, that 38%, none of them have committed a suicide attack on any site in Kurdistan. Now, of course, that requires diligent governance, diligent security forces, but it also requires the support of the population. And by the way, the IDPs, when I say internally displaced people, we're talking about Sunnis who are now living in Kurdistan. Who were the people who committed the genocide against the Kurds? There were Sunni Arabs. You would think that there will be retaliation. You would think that there will be mass murder of these refugees, now that they are the underdogs. But, I'm very proud to say that that has not been the case. That, in fact, it's been a welcoming society. And that's because the society came together. The society came together. It's not just, it's not just a government task. It's also a societal task. And I can also tell you, the role of the religious institutions, of the women's groups, of the universities. I was a university professor, and the weekends a quarter of the students would go to these refugee camps to teach them English, teach them hygiene, make sure that the camps are clean. The society comes together to care of these people, and that creates a long impact on the people. Now they come and they say, we're sorry that once upon a time we were not as nice to you, as they were. So I think the Kurds as a minority have now found themselves in self-governing regions where they are a majority, but they're passing the goodness that was offered to them by the international community forward to a refugee community that comes from Syria and an IDP community that comes from the rest of the country. And I think we're making inroads in terms of peace and reconciliation through the respect for human rights. Thank you very much. All right. Solid enough? No? Okay. Much better. Thank you, Mimi.
Thank you, Bilal. Thank you very much. Bilal, thank you very much indeed. Thank you. Now, we are so excited to have Sarah. Sarah, who is going to open another frontier for all of us in her discussion of North Africa as ISIS joins with other Islamist-led derivatives to bring terror and radicalized elements of the Islamic faith to that region. King Mohammed VI of Morocco is managing to control an anti-monarchist movement in his country. Tunisia, as you know, is struggling to restore peace after terrorist attacks last year. And I'm sure that you're wondering, as am I, what will come next. So Sarah, come and tell us, please.
So, spoiler alert, I don't know what's coming next, but I can offer some thoughts nonetheless. So actually I'm going to move through. I think these were perhaps, okay, that's me. Okay, I have only one slide. I'm a little more old school. My colleagues think this slide makes it seem like I'm still in high school. I think it's a nice, colorful slide. I'm going to, as Mimi said, I'm going to talk a little bit about the scene across North Africa. So I'm going to take you all out of the war-torn region in the Levant and bring you to a slightly more, I think, optimistic part of the Arab world today, where nonetheless these questions of human rights and minority relations between minorities and majorities are, and no less the fight against extremist groups like ISIS, these issues are still very much front and center. I also just want to say that I'm very happy to be here, and I want to thank Mimi and really everyone for welcoming us to your community. And I was thinking about this on the way down here from Washington, that the ability of religious communities such as yourself to create spaces where we can talk about these issues and ask the really tough questions. I think that's really sacred. And so it's something that you all should, I think, feel very proud to be hosting that. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about this question of minorities in North Africa, and then I'll offer some sort of general observations about the region, and then zoom in on Morocco, which is sort of the northwestern edge of the Arab world, and I'll zoom in and then maybe bring it back out at the very end. Okay, so how do we understand the predicament of minorities in North Africa? Well, generally speaking, a few observations here. First of all, and here I'm going to be really addressing the countries west of Egypt. Egypt, as we know, has a Coptic community, a community of Coptic Christians, which predates the arrival of Islam, obviously, in Egypt. Egypt is in a little bit of a situation on its own. So I'm going to be talking more about the countries west of Egypt. And what we find in those countries is, first of all, and I think this may be of particular interest to this audience, Christianity, of course, came to North Africa almost right after the birth of the religion. But there were then, long sort of periods of interrupted presence of Christians in North Africa. The point I want to convey, the first point I want to convey here, is that today's Christian communities in North Africa mostly date to the colonial period. That is to say, the period, and it varied from one country to the next, of European political authority in this part of the world. So whether that was the Italians in Libya starting around 1911, or the French in Tunisia, Algeria, Morocco. The French were in Algeria starting in 1830. In Tunisia and Morocco, in Tunisia it was later in the 19th century, and in Morocco, the country I'm going to focus on today, the French arrived in 1912 and set up a protectorate. It wasn't quite, the presence of the French in Morocco was not quite as extensive as it was in Algeria, which was a full-fledged French colony. But I'd like you to keep this in mind, because the one broad argument I'd like to suggest is that, when we talk about relations between religious communities in this part of the world, it's very important to keep in mind the political context in which religious communities interact. And so in the case of North Africa, the association with Christianity today still retains something of an association with the political context of colonialism, okay? Now, when these countries gained their independence from European colonial rule, and again, the dates of that varied depending on which country you're looking at, but most of these states, in their constitutions, declared Islam to be the religion of the state, okay? Now, this was done in part, I think, to imbue the political authorities that were now taking over with the exit of the Europeans, now the indigenous Arab political elites who were going to take political control. It was a way to shore up some legitimacy. It was also a way to connect the political leadership with the majority population, in a sense to say, we are all one and the same here. Now we are in charge of ourselves, and here is one indication of that. Islam is going to be the religion of the state. Now, at the same time that these, and this is a term that's used throughout the constitutions of these countries. At the same time, there was a general acknowledgement and a desire, frankly, to allow minority religious communities full autonomy, okay? And this gets back to the system that I think Andrew was mentioning, that had been practiced in most of the Ottoman Empire, of religious communities and minorities generally having their say of how they wanted to govern their own communities. So, in a sense, the difficulties that religious minorities have faced in North Africa, by and large, those difficulties have stemmed not from formal state-sponsored repression or persecution, at least not in the modern period, but rather from individual vigilantism sometimes and individual acts of violence. So I'll give you an example. My mother was born in Morocco to parents who were actually Algerian Jews. Now, the Jews in this part of the world, to just briefly talk about another minority group, the Jews in this part of the world, there had been, again, Jews that predated most other communities here, but the most recent communities of Jews across North Africa had dated mostly from the Spanish Inquisition and from the expulsion of Jews south. So my mom's family were living in Algeria, going back centuries as far as we know. And they had moved to a little town on the border between Algeria and Morocco, and so my mother happened to be born in Morocco. The Jews of Algeria, because as I mentioned earlier, the French had colonized Algeria in 1830, and one of the first things that the French did was give Jews French citizenship, okay? We can debate why that happened. There's probably a little bit of dividing and conquering going on. But nonetheless, my mom's family had the French citizenship. So in 1960, my mom was about 13, there started to be acts of kidnapping in the area that she was living in. The Moroccan state had actually been very careful to be protective of the Jewish community. But, you know, people are people, and they're not always able to be controlled, and violence was breaking out. And in the case of Morocco at this period, what she sort of can recall is that there was a sense that, well, the Jewish families have a lot of money, so, you know, kidnapping them, the kidnappings were happening for ransom. Okay, that was the aim. And so in the case of my mother's family, who, by the way, did not have a lot of money, it so happened, so they would not have made for very good, you know, kidnappees, I suppose. But they left Morocco mostly because they were just concerned about their personal safety, their situation. But my mother, you know, if you ask her today what she recalls of the king of Morocco, for example, she has very fond memories of the Moroccan leadership. And so that's just something to keep in mind. Okay, so as I said, most of these states had declared Islam to be the formal state religion. In Morocco, and now I'm going to zoom in a little bit, Morocco has had, and Morocco was no different. Morocco was one of these countries that at independence in 1956 approved a constitution that said Islam is the religion of the state. Morocco, at the time, the leader who emerged from the nationalist struggle against the French was a monarch. He was a member of a dynasty that had been ruling over parts of Morocco since the 17th century. This is a dynasty that claims descent from the Prophet Muhammad, from the family of the Prophet. So in addition to taking on the role of head of state in 1956, the king also was declared the chief spiritual or religious authority in the country, the Amir al-Mu'minin, the commander of the faithful, as the Moroccans call him. And that term, a few things to just note about that term. First of all, a commander of the faithful has generally been understood in Morocco to apply not just, this is not the commander of the Muslims, okay? This is the commander of the faithful, which has generally been understood to include Jewish and Christian communities in Morocco. So the idea is that the king is the protector of all of these communities. And at the same time, the state has this formal affiliation or association with the religion of the majority population. Just to sort of touch for a moment on the numbers, what numbers are we talking about in Morocco? So when Morocco gained its independence from the French, prior to that, I mean, at one point Morocco had been home to roughly 500,000, mostly European Christians, and around the same number of Jews. Today, there are an estimated 5,000 practicing Christians in the kingdom, and somewhere between 3,000 and 5,000 Jews in Morocco. This is out of a population of 33 million. So dwindling numbers for various reasons that we can talk about perhaps in the Q&A. But I want to get back to just the sort of basic storyline here in Morocco of what happened with this notion of Islam being the religion of the state, what that meant for minorities, and how the state has handled questions of religious extremism. Because it's a story that with variations on the theme can be seen in other countries, definitely across North Africa, and I would even venture to say in some of the countries that we've heard about today. So even though the king in Morocco has had this religious identification and therefore a pretty hefty dose of legitimacy, his rule was not uncontested, even at independence. And you had in Morocco throughout the 60s and 70s especially, the emergence of opposition groups, political parties. Unlike a lot of other Arab countries at the time, Morocco actually established a multi-party political system with a parliament. So there arose during these decades after independence various opposition parties and movements, many of which were leftist, often socialist, but by and large secular opposition movements. And one of the ways in which the monarchy tried to deflect that opposition was by, it did a very kind of political thing, which is it reached out to more religious circles within Morocco for support, and as a way to counteract some of the leftist movements that were emerging to really challenge the authority of the monarchy. Some of these groups just didn't think Morocco should have a monarchy. Some of them were upset with the way the monarchy was governing. Whatever the reason, the monarchy reached out to religious movements. And in a sense, what we've been seeing in the last 2 decades, roughly, is the fruits of the success of that policy, which is to say that the monarchy in Morocco, like many of the regimes elsewhere in the Arab world, did quite a good job of counteracting and ultimately more or less eliminating the kind of leftist secular sources of opposition. But it came at a cost, which was the promotion of some of these religious groups came back to bite the regime, you know where. And what in the case of Morocco, even with a monarch who has significant religious authority and therefore retains much popularity as a result of that, you have had movements in Morocco challenging the legitimacy of the monarchy on religious grounds. So whether that's been movements growing out of the Muslim Brotherhood or more violent movements that have emerged, the growing threat to the regime in Morocco has come from more radical Islamist movements. And you can sort of look at this and say, well, this is sort of puzzling. I mean, how is it that, a regime, a leader who himself has religious credentials and is able to give religious interpretations and guidance and teachings, and how is it that groups are able to really challenge him? And I think I would say to that it's, this is still all very much a contested space. I mean, when you put in a constitution that Islam is the religion of the state, well, that begs the question, which Islam? Whose Islam? How are we going to define the Islam that we're talking about? And as soon as you start to define it, you find, as you would find, I think, in all faith traditions, you're going to get challengers. And in the case of Morocco, these debates have been especially pronounced in the educational realm, which is perhaps not surprising because that's where most countries think of forming their citizens. What does it mean to be Moroccan? What does it mean to be Muslim? Well, those questions are addressed usually in schools and in religious centers of religious learning. So throughout the 80s and 90s, what Morocco saw was this kind of bubbling up of increasingly radical religious activity in the kingdom. In 2003, Casablanca was the site of a major bombing. This is what most Moroccans refer to as their 9/11. It was an attack that targeted a number of Jewish and European, read Christian, sites in the kingdom. Ultimately, in fact, most of the victims were Muslim because the sites were not occupied at the time by the religious communities that the attackers, I think, were targeting. But this led to a sort of a much more comprehensive set of reforms that the kingdom had in fact already started to undertake in terms of rewriting its school curricula, taking a closer look at what was being taught in mosques and other settings. With the 2003 attack, the regime really went on the offensive and started a wholesale reform of the religious realm in Morocco more generally. And this has meant that the king is now invoking his authority as the leading religious leader, essentially, the leading religious authority in the kingdom, to do things like start new imam training programs, reform curricula to make sure that notions of human rights and pluralism and respect for minorities are front and center in the school textbooks. Morocco has been bringing in hundreds of young people who are aspiring religious leaders in their countries, mostly in West Africa, but also we're seeing increasingly from Europe, to come and be trained and retrained in Morocco. And so here you have a case of a Muslim country engaging in a reform, drawing on its own Islamic traditions to counteract very radical interpretations of that tradition. And it's been a fascinating experiment, and it's one that I think the U.S. ought to be supporting, and we are. We have a very good relationship with the Moroccans. And in fact, Morocco has been a member of the anti-ISIS coalition. The Moroccan Air Force flew some planes with us early on when the coalition began its operations in Syria. And they are very much a partner in this fight against extremism, in part because I think they have been a victim of it, and in part because they realize that the stakes are very high for everyone, for minorities included, but also for the Muslim world more generally. And they see this as a fight predominantly within the Muslim world, and they hope to win. So I'll stop there, and I look forward to the discussion. Thanks.
We can see how tall Sarah is. Grown. Now, just in summary, before the Q&A, I would like to say that in this age of globalization, we are all touched by worldwide consequences. We are all conscious that our Judeo-Christian values remain challenged in this world, and that the human rights divide remains a struggle for peace and security in the future. But as Americans, we are grateful for our Constitution, whose First Amendment ensures, and I quote, the fundamental guarantees for the protection of religion and belief, and may it always be so. And I thank you all very, very much for being here. We're going to have just a brief pause while we rearrange this stage and put our stars up there. And there are 2 microphones on the sides, and they're going to be guarded by 2 of our gentlemen hosts here today. And I hope that you will gather your questions and step up to one of the microphones when everybody gets settled. Okay.
Well, in the absence of everybody else, I have 2 questions. One, when you look at the Syrian refugees leaving, they all look like young, able-bodied men. So I'm curious as to why they're leaving and not defending. And the second question I have is, currently you hear from the new administration that perhaps we don't need to get rid of Assad, that he can stay there. So on those 2 notes, I'd welcome any feedback.
Sure. So why do you see able-bodied young men leaving? Because they're civilians, as you are. Because now the question is, why weren't they staying and picking up arms and fighting? It could be the groups fighting in that area are not in line with them. It would be the same as Shanghaiing Christians in to fight with other forces inside of Syria. People are running for their lives. That's the reason why they're now. It does get to, I think the heart of your question is, why don't these people have anything to stay and to believe in and to fight for? And I think it's because the incoherence of many aspects of the opposition. I think the brutality of the regime scares away a whole other part of the, particularly minorities, and they have to also run for their lives and leave. And in the end, it creates this problem. In terms of Assad staying, not to put too fine of a point on it, but the Trump administration's campaign is to fight ISIS. We have had in name a strategy to get rid of Assad by the Obama administration, but it was only in name. That was over years ago. The movement in the last 24 hours or 48 hours to say that Assad was going to stay is true. He's going to stay, but as you could see from the map, he controls about a third of Syrian territory. So I'm not saying that's insignificant. I'm not saying that tyranny doesn't work, because it does, unfortunately, in these environments. But the reason why we're talking about protecting civilians and safe zones and things isn't because anybody really wants to build them. It's because it begs the question, who's going to take over this other two-thirds of Syrian territory? I mean, many of you have served in the armed forces. I saw some of you saluting during the national anthem, right? 18,000 troops to take two-thirds of Syrian territory? That's not going to happen, right? Unless you want to import a lot of Shia militia from Iran. Or the Russians want to put troops into Syria, which they don't, right? And so, thus, we are set with this divided Syria, where Assad stays, the country has a large Kurdish area, and we have a chaotic Sunni-dominated area. And then that way, it's like Back to the Future. It's like Iraq in the 1990s, except the regime in Syria is far weaker. And the problem for your communities, and here I'm talking about Eastern Orthodox Christians, but not only, could apply to all minorities, is that in the short term, these communities huddle around the regime for self-protection, but they know that there's no strategy to get out of it. There's no political strategy other than to shoot people into submission. Now, not only is that not in line with the teachings of Jesus Christ, as I understand them, right? But most importantly, if you don't have a strategy, you're going to have endless war. And so in the end, the only solution as you huddle around these tyrannies, and Syria is one of the last minority-dominated systems, is that Christians have to leave in order to survive. Now, you can live to fight another day, and my family came here in 1732. We were Protestants chased out of the Palatinate, right? And you can live, and so on, and that is one method to deal with this. But I think we would all be better off at focusing on, and I think Sarah and Bilal focused on this a little bit, and that is we have to focus on governance in these countries. It's not a matter of democratization or not. It's why is it that over half the Syrian population has run away from the Syrian army? Right? That's a lot of people. Why is it that they're incapable of reform? Why is it that we are reticent to get involved in these countries to help them find solutions? And until we all work together to solve them, I'm afraid we're going to have more and more migrants and have more problems and more threats.
Yes, ma'am. Would you like to ask a question?
I have a question for Sarah. We visited Morocco almost 20 years ago and had quite a few guides and went all over the country, about 2,000 miles. And we had several guides and people that we were introduced to who had grown up Jewish and Christian, and their families had decided to stay in Morocco, but they claimed they were forced to convert. Can you answer how many people, of our faiths were forced to convert in order to stay, as opposed to how many left the country?
So I don't have those numbers offhand. What I can tell you is that there is in Morocco, it is illegal. In other words, it is not legal to seek to convert Muslims to Christianity. So even as you have a constitution which preserves the rights of minorities to practice their faith freely, and it's something that the monarchy takes very seriously, you also have a penal code that does criminalize proselytization to Christianity. So it's complicated. It's unresolved, but I don't have precise figures for you in terms of the number of conversions to try to
The one
to
that
stay.
was kind of interesting is a fellow who had a very, very large business, and a very large business, and he said in order to be able to save his business and his family's business, he was an elderly man who was like third generation Jewish. They just converted. Have you heard those stories before?
Not a lot, but occasionally, yes. So it's, it's very unfortunate. I'm a little surprised. I'm a little surprised, actually, to hear it, only because, in my experience being in Morocco, there is a real, the tolerance, at least so far as I have been able to gather when I've lived there, and I've always been open about my own religious identity. The tolerance is real, so I'm not sure. I believe this what you're saying, and for various reasons, I gather that these particular individuals felt that they would, it was, if they were going to stay, they needed to evidently they needed to convert to it, right. But by and large, in my experience, living there and traveling back and forth, I haven't encountered much of that. The communities are dwindling, that's true. The numbers I cited, people have been leaving, partly for economic reasons. At least in the Jewish community, which is the one I know a bit better, for the most part, this has to do with seeking economic advancement elsewhere and feeling that the opportunities in Morocco are just not, they just can't compete with what people who are able to leave would find in Europe or in Canada or even in Israel increasingly. But I'm not, I don't know as much about, for those who stay, this issue of the conversion.
Thanks.
Sorry, I can't give you more specific.
Yes, sir.
I have a question for Sarah. What concerns me greatly is what defense does moderate Islam have against radical Islam? Both use the Quran as their basis for their faith. Is there any effort underway to clean up the Quran?
Well, I think, respectfully, I think that we will see an effort to clean up the Quran when we see an effort to clean up the New Testament and when we see an effort to clean up the Old Testament, for that matter. I'm not sure that the heart of the problem is what is in the Quran, though you are completely right that all of these groups, whether from Al-Qaeda to the reformists whom I mentioned in the Moroccan context, are drawing on not just the Quran, also they're drawing on traditions attributed to the Prophet and other classical religious texts that for centuries informed life in the Islamic world, that really have only recently been interpreted in ways that I think most Orthodox, and I use Orthodox not in the sense that we here in this room might use it, but in the sense of as opposed to heterodox or offshoot sects, that most Orthodox Muslims have understood for centuries. So if you look in all of these texts, you can find what you're looking for. The efforts that I know of to draw out of the Quran one of the streams of effort that you have seen in the last, and this has been going on now for over a century, is trying to contextualize passages in the Quran. In other words, to try and to determine, because we know when certain passages were revealed to the prophet. We know essentially the order of the revelation. And so there have been efforts on the part of Muslim and non-Muslim intellectuals, but Muslim intellectual reformist types, to try and place the passages that may strike us as more difficult, less palatable, in the historical context of the actual revelation. And I think those are some interesting, that has yielded some interesting reformism, if you will. And so that's just one example of a kind of, it's not cleaning up so much as placing things in their proper historical context. I mean, another example is efforts that are underway to try and demonstrate how Quranic teachings and also traditions of the prophet, how these were, for their time, pretty remarkable advancements. So whether it came to the question of women, developing this idea that women were entitled to an inheritance, this was a big deal at the time. Now, again, everything has its historical context. So I think it's a little bit less about cleaning up than contextualizing.
I'd like to.
Well, can I ask a follow-up? How can you, or how can one then defend Sharia law in this age?
Well, I'm gonna, I'll put my Muslim colleague on the spot, but I would just say that, I do think we need to be a little careful about how we use the term Sharia. I mean, there isn't Sharia is not a book. It's not a single volume that, you can go to and say, okay, this is, all of Sharia law is in this one book. Sharia refers to a combination of teachings in the Quran, the behaviors and the sayings attributed to the Prophet Muhammad, and also a whole body of juridical text interpretations that came in the centuries after the Prophet. What became the main bodies of Islamic law, and there are several of them, and they don't always agree with each other. And within the bodies of law, there is disagreement, and there is room for, pretty varied interpretations within those bodies of law. Those all together, that corpus, we can refer to as Sharia, but there is a lot of wiggle room in there, and so I do think we need to be a little careful about what we mean when we talk about Sharia. But I'll let my colleagues on the panel maybe contribute more.
One thing I want to say is when Americans use the phrase, there's a lot of words at play here when we talk about this issue, and it's got a lot of different textures to it, and we tend to generalize, especially as Americans, on these subjects where we don't have a lot of understanding except for headlines, and we have a lot of fear. And that's what's great about a symposium like this, is that we've got great speakers that are coming in that have firsthand knowledge. But, when Americans speak about various forms of Islam, when we say moderate Islam, I think what most of us are really thinking is reform Islam, is what we're really looking for. Reformers, like there was Reform Christianity and Judaism, at certain points in the history of these faiths, people were going off the reservation also, and I think what we're seeking are reformists, like we were talking about Morocco. Individuals that are taking a look at their faith and the way it's practiced and the political aspects of it, and want to take steps to actually reform the faith and bring it up to date. And if you read some sources, such as there's a great online source called MEMRI.org, MEMRI, Middle Eastern Media Research Institute. And you see what a lot of Muslim scholars are saying. It's the good, the bad, and the ugly, but you'll read a lot about the call for reform, sort of to get in line with 21st century values and morals, so that everybody can get along better, and that the Western world would feel more comfortable with the Islam that when we grew up, we were taught there were three great world religions: Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, and we thought nothing of it until the Iranian Revolution of 1980 and all the things that have transpired. So what we, I think, as Americans are really looking for, to have some sort of comfort zone worldwide, are reformists that are really going to take steps to reform the faith and more comport with values, for better or worse, that we in the Western world have a comfort level with.
Maybe I'll just say a few words about this issue very briefly. I agree with what Sarah said, that Sharia law is not just a book. It's the religious code. So, for example, in a country like Iraq, the constitution says that Islam is a source or the source of jurisprudence, and that no law should be passed that is against the principles of Islam, and no law shall be passed that's against the principles of human rights. Now, that may sound like an oxymoron to you, but that is the Iraqi way, the democratic way, and just of dealing with, the realities of the 21st century, to quote Ruth, and also this religious heritage that we as Muslims are proud of, and we want to, remain good Muslims. But that's not a challenge to be solved, in Washington or in London. That's a problem that ultimately needs to be solved, in Cairo and in Baghdad and in Mecca and in the Muslim capitals, and probably I should say in Dhaka and Malaysia and Indonesia, in the Muslim countries. And it is a struggle. The number one victim of ISIS, they're not the Christians, they're not the Yazidis, they're the Muslims. They're killing more Muslims than the other minorities. And of course, the focus from the Western media is mainly on the minorities. I'm not saying that's a mistake, but that's what makes the headlines here. But when you sit in a room full of Muslims, do you think that people don't ask the question that, what the heck is wrong with us? I mean, we do ask the question. It is there. Some people try to blame the books, some people try to blame the history, some people try to blame the culture and the tribalism. Oh, many others try to blame colonialism, the history of not being able to, a modern history of not being able to stand on our feet. Many people, yearn for, I mean, you hear, for example, people being afraid of the use of the word ummah. Okay, yeah, afraid of being, afraid of a Muslim empire. But many people look back with nostalgia at the Muslim empire because that's the only time that the Muslim world had some respect. I mean, I mentioned to you how the Middle East was carved out, by people who did not even understand the region. You have to also sympathize and empathize with the people of the region. They feel like victims. So this is on more of a broader point. But let me also make maybe a more minute point here. The bane of the Middle East is not religion. The bane of the Middle East, the main problem of the Middle East is oppression. Oppression in the name of secularism, as we have seen in the history of Turkey and Tunisia, where religion has been oppressed. You could not practice your religion. You could not dress up in a way that represents your religion, as happened in Tunisia and Turkey, for example. Or religious oppression in Iran, oppression in the name of religion. Oppression by any name is oppression. And in Iran, yes, it's called the Islamic State. But believe it or not, in Tehran, the capital of the Islamic Republic, there is not a single Sunni mosque. It's oppression of a different flavor. It's a sectarian oppression. So when you live under oppression, I think we need to think about how freedom do you have? How much freedom do you have to think about, intellectual reforms, religious reforms? I mean, you need to have a level of stability and space as well as freedom to be able to think, what's wrong with me? What's wrong with us? What can we do better? But unfortunately, as you look at the history of the region, we haven't had the chance to breathe. It's conflict after conflict. The way that I described it the other day is that conflicts in the Middle East are like chain smoking. You light one with the other. And in this environment, I think it's probably too much of an ask to do of the Middle East to then reform their religion, let alone fix their holy books. Now, of course, there is an opportunity here, I think, for interfaith dialogue. There is an opportunity for the Muslims to learn from the Christians. I mean, the Christians had their fair share of, in the history of extremism, right? Well, the Crusaders, right? Thank you, right? I mean, that's a history. But instead of, I mean, you learn from that history, a lesson or two. So what can we learn from our recent history? How can you help us, instead of antagonizing sort of the efforts of the Muslim world? How can we learn? I think that's probably a question that's worth exploring, instead of sort of, blaming each other. And also, we also have a tendency, this is psychologically proven, that we have a tendency for bad news and bad memories than good memories. So we have a long history of, Muslim, Jewish, Christian coexistence. But of course, the negative episodes in this long history gets more attention than the extended periods of coexistence.
Let's go over here first, because you've been waiting, and then we'll come over to your side. Thank you. And we're just going to finish up these last few questions.
In terms of secularism, as Turkey turns away from secularism, how do you see Turkey's religious future? And will they continue to support people of other religions? Is there anyone care to answer that?
Andrew?
To protect those worshipers.
Sure. So so over time, the Ataturk's model in Turkey has been changed by President Erdogan, who has a referendum on, I think it's on Easter Sunday, well, Western Eastern Sunday, the 16th of this month, to change the country to a presidential system. Now, that will bring with it a lot more control by Erdogan, but the problem is that the role of the AKP party in Turkey today has brought the country closer over time to has reintroduced, rather, Islam back into society and made the country, I think, theoretically less secular. Now, that being said, there still are extensive laws on the books in Turkey that do protect those who are not Muslims and that do try and push out this secular order. But the country over time has shifted, as I think, you can, in one way it's not surprising. I remember when I lived in Turkey, the EU held Turkey at arm's length for membership. And so a lot of governments, successive governments, rose and fell over the success of that project. And when it finally didn't happen, then Turkey began to look towards the Middle East. And the Middle East is majority Muslim, majority Sunni Muslim. So therefore, it's maybe unsurprising that the country then went down that road. Where it will all end up is another matter, right? Because there are a lot of other problems in Turkey that had to do with border security, fundamentalism that's come in, extremism from Syria, that could prove actually the country's, not the entire country's undoing, of course, but could destabilize large parts of Turkish society. And that usually brings a pretty strong response from the Turkish state by their army and security services.
And the last question, please.
Hi, I'm Casey Jeffries, and my question is for Bilal. You mentioned it's about the Kurds, and you mentioned that it's the one peoples in the world that do not have a nation, a country. Do you foresee sometime in the future, in years to come, or after, the Kurds having a nation, establishing a nation for themselves?
Thank you very much, Casey. The closest that the Kurds are, and again, I think let me preface it by my answer by saying that the possibility of bringing all of the Kurds and establishing one nation for the Kurds, so that map that I overlay over the current geopolitical map of the Middle East, I don't think that's possible in the near future. These four histories have really diverged the Kurdish population. So we're talking about four different groups with, yes, ethnic, historical, and religious ties, but the politics of the regions and therefore their histories have really diverged tremendously. What is possible is that for these, maybe at least in the near term, is for these Kurdish communities in these four respective countries to gain more rights. The closest to statehood are the Kurds of Iraq. In 1992, under the safe haven that was provided by the international community led by the United States, the Kurds experienced self-governance for the first time. There were elections, the Kurdistan regional government was formed, and it has been governing that territory ever since. In 2003, after the invasion of Iraq, and of course in 2005 when Iraq's constitution was written, the status of the Kurdistan region of Iraq was enshrined in the constitution, in the new Iraqi constitution, as a semi-autonomous region. What that means is that the region has its own military force, its own police, its own government, including the three legislatures of a democratic government, the judiciary, the executive, and the legislature. But its currency and foreign policy remains as part of Iraq. Now, this partnership between the Kurds and the Arabs ruling New Iraq, post-2003 Iraq, has had, tortuous, to say the least, but it has had its ups and downs. Now, the Kurds feel that this partnership has not worked, and this marriage should not be forced on both sides. So a way out is in the books. One way that the Kurds are discussing is to have a referendum to prove it to the international community that the Kurds want their own country. Another approach, or maybe a mix of two, is to negotiate a divorce with Baghdad in which the Kurds either declare independence and fly a flag in the UN headquarters in New York, or become more autonomous, but stay within the borders of current Iraq. So that's sort of the story of Iraqi Kurdistan and the two possible trajectories in the near future. The second possibility of Kurdish self-governance lies in Syria. In Syria, as I mentioned, there is a Kurdish, there is a force, the SDF, dominated by the Kurds. So they provide for security of the Kurdish region. They have been governing, although their governance experience is short. And they also have the other challenge of the areas that they control are not contiguous. So they have basically pockets, that the pockets are not connected, and geographic contiguity, geographic connection is important to have a geography and call it a country. So that's sort of a challenge. Another challenge is, of course, neighbors, mainly Turkey, and of course, the Assad regime. Do these governments, and of course, is the region ready for the map of the Middle East to be redrawn? The map of the Middle East has proven to be very stringent, and even the United States, when went to the war, had a plan to redraw that map, but I think the map has so far prevailed despite all of the intentions of giving the Kurds their own country. I think the Kurds are ready for statehood. Maybe the international community is trying to adapt to the reality of a Kurdish country in its midst. Thank you.
I just want to thank this panel and their speeches. It's just such an inspiring afternoon. Thank you all very much. And now, before I invite, also thank you to the questionnaires, very, very good questions. Before I invite Father Michael Orsi for the benediction, I want again to thank you for coming to the symposium. And we hope, of course, you can find it in your hearts to support us, continue to support us for the future. You can go to christianrightsandfreedom.org, one word, christianrightsandfreedom.org online to make a donation or become a subscriber. We do all our communications via email or online. So if you wish to receive any literature from us in the future and we don't have your email, please, before you leave your email with us, or you can email us at christianrightsandfreedom@gmail.com. And you can get in contact with us at any time, day or night, 24/7, including religious holidays. We will soon be conducting a survey online. Please give us your input about how you felt about this year's programming and what your ideas might be about next year's programming. We will consider all ideas as we make our selection, of course, for the next year. And again, remind you that there's a reception in the back of the room with some hors d'oeuvres, or chocolates, whatever they have, the ladies, that's wonderful. And so that will take place immediately after the benediction by Father Michael. Enjoy fellowship And thank you again for honoring us with your presence. And now I invite Father Michael Orsi of St. Agnes Catholic Church to give us the benediction. Please rise. Thank you.
Before I offer the benediction, I want to thank Father Philemon and Dr. Demopoulos for letting me be a part of this wonderful, wonderful Christian Rights and Freedom Institute. It was a tremendous learning experience, and it's something that all Christians should be concerned about. For St. Catherine's Church, for the people here that have contributed so much to make this so possible. God bless you all. Let us pray. Almighty God, our Father, you are the author of life. When you give us life, you give us freedom at the same time. Let us always seek to offer our praise to you in spirit and in truth. And let us be aware that our most sacred freedom must always be protected. We ask this through Christ our Lord. And may Almighty God bless you all in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Thank you.